Yeah, good evening. I'm Henry Neufeld. I'm the owner of Energeon Publications, and tonight I'm joined by a quite distinguished panel. I'll start with Doug Dortch, who's the senior minister at Mountain Brook Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, has a PhD in Christian preaching from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and I've spent part of my afternoon reading some of his sermons, so I think he's going to have some worthwhile things to say about preaching, which is the primary topic of the evening. Also with us is Dr. Bob Cornwall. Dr. Bob is the editor of our Energeon series, Conversation in Ministry and Guides to Practical Ministry, which are produced together with the Academy of Parish Clergy. I'm holding up his book, Unfettered Spirit, which was the Academy of Parish Clergy's one of their 12 books of the year this year for parish ministry. So he's the author of several more books, but we're not going to list all of them. He has a PhD in historical theology from Fuller. Also with us is Dr. David Moffett-Moore, and the book I'm holding up from him is Creation and Contemporary Experience. He's written on a variety of topics, including one of the Conversation in Ministry books titled Wind and Whirlwind, Being a Pastor in a Storm of Change. That's a book that I would like to give to any number of pastors I've had conversations with. And as a matter of fact, I hardly recall having a conversation with a pastor who couldn't deal with some help with dealing with change in the congregation. Left to last but not least, we're introducing the book Overcoming Sermon Block by William Powell Tuck. Bill is the author of 27 books, and Overcoming Sermon Block is the first in our new Guides to Practical Ministry series, again, which is produced in cooperation, partnership with the Academy of Parish Clergy. And I also should mention that Bob Cornwall is the editor-in-chief for that series. I am, by my own appointment, editor-in-chief for Energeon Publications, so we will probably both of us have a word or two to say about the book series. But we're going to stick primarily with preaching and preachers tonight, and I'm not going to take up any more time from what we can do for learning. And I'm going to pass the first question to Bill Tuck. And this is, in your career as a pastor and a teacher of preachers, what do you think are the biggest challenges to the preacher and why? That should give you, that's a broad question, so we give you a lot of room to maneuver there.
Well, it is a big question, but I think the biggest challenge to most preachers or pastors is simply to learn how to allocate that time, because they have to have time for sermon preparation, have to have time for pastoral ministry, including visitation, hospital work, counseling. They also have to have time for administration and time for family. Most ministers, I have noticed, simply do not know how to balance that time appropriately. They give too much to one area and not enough to the other. And I think this is one of the greatest challenges in ministry, especially in sermon preparation. Sometimes all the other things get first place, and then sermon preparation gets a little minuscule time, which is usually not enough. And that's the reason we often end up with some kind of sermon block.
Okay, does anybody else want to comment on that before we go to the question about what is sermon block?
Well, I think that the timing issue that that Bill talks about is one that we do struggle with, and I think that depending on the size of a congregation and whether one has staff, as a pastor of a smaller congregation who's also active in the community, you know, the staff-wise, you know, you end up taking care of everything. I do devote, hopefully, sufficient time to my preparation, but that's not always easy. There are some weeks where you're wondering on Saturday whether it's going to come together.
I recently was asked to help a congregation that had a woman pastor who said that she never had free time. Every spare minute was she received telephone calls all the time, everything else, and they simply would not even allow her enough time to prepare sermons. And so part of what I had to help them do was to work on a balance so that they could see how she can't do everything all the time. The congregation themselves, she didn't have but one associate, and so the congregation needed to assume some responsibility and also to give her some bridge and protection of time for sermon preparation.
I think part of the challenge is that, go ahead, David.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
Part of the challenge is helping our congregations understand the time constraints under which we labor. I've always been surprised at how few people recognize the amount of time that pastoral ministry takes out of us. I've had many say to me how wonderful it must be to have a job where you only work 3 or 4 hours a week, speaking about those hours when we preach or teach. But Bill is correct. It's an enormous task, and sometimes to be able to allocate the appropriate amount of time to the task, we have to help our congregations understand just how much preaching requires of us and being ready to preach.
I've got a couple of questions for Bill, taking advantage of his years of experience both as a pastor and as a professor. One is, what questions or considerations have you found to be most helpful as you have prioritized your own schedule to allow adequate time for preaching and preparation?
Well, one of the things I have always asked of my congregation is to let me have certain hours that are uninterrupted except for emergencies for study time. And for me, most of the time, that was the mornings. I would get at the church early and sometimes go until, 11 o'clock. And if there are emergencies or something, then of course that's different. But you can't prepare sermons without having uninterrupted time. And I did most of my sermon preparation at church in my study there. Not everybody does that. Some ministers do theirs at home. But one of the things you need to talk to your congregation as you're coming as the new pastor, or even now, if you've been there a while, and tell them you need some time and ask them to honor that. If you have a secretary, of course, she can protect you there. And if you can't, you just learn not to answer your phone unless it's some emergency.
Okay. I've found the need to distinguish what I call study time apart from preparation time. Preparation time is something I'm working on for this week, and study time is something I'm working on for down the road, weeks or sometimes months later, just to let that gestate.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. I'm going to talk a little bit later probably about the need for long-range planning, which is very important for ministers.
Okay. Now, while I've got the floor, the other question I have, again, it's drawn on your years of experience in a variety of settings. In my Wind and Whirlwind book, one of the things I talk about is how pastoring has changed over the years, and I'd like to hear you address specifically how the preaching task has changed over the last couple of decades.
Well, when I was a pastor, most of my ministry, I preached Sunday morning, Sunday night, and was responsible for teaching on Wednesday night. That's 3 preparations. That's insanity, if you think about it. Nobody can really do that but so well. But I mean, I think over the years, of course, most ministers today focus on Sunday morning, and then they may do book studies or other kinds of things on Wednesday night or Bible studies. But preaching has changed dramatically over the years. For one thing, a lot of people are not as enthusiastic about preaching as they was at one time. I mean, in Fred Craddock's book is One Without Authority. That's part of his basic theme there, in which he talks how preaching has gone on to decline in a lot of places. And so also your congregation is usually not very biblically alert. They don't know a lot of the Bible. They don't even know sometimes the definitions of faith and spiritual words and images, so that has to be defined. People also can't sit very long and listen to preaching because they have such a short attention span. So a lot of that has really transformed preaching, and preachers have to learn to adapt to that, prepare a little different kind of sermon, not as long. I mean, you know, preachers used to do 45-minute sermons, an hour sermon. I don't know of almost any congregation that will tolerate that. If you can get much beyond 20 minutes, you're going to be very fortunate. 25 at the most in some congregations. But there have been radical changes, and the preacher needs to be aware of that. And in a lot of congregations, we're preaching mostly to older people, and some you have a wide spectrum of people. But there are a lot of real changes that are taking place there.
Thank you.
Okay, well, if that's the question there, as a consumer of preaching rather than a preacher myself, I was very interested reading through this book that Bill does not give any kind of a short answer. And in particular, he talks about the pastor's, everything from the pastor's spiritual life all the way through. Now, I've heard any number of sermons as as a congregant that sounded like sermon block may have occurred somewhere before this sermon was preached. So I was interested in in seeing especially the portions of the book about spiritual preparation. The one thing I noticed, you don't have anything in here that says, here's a way to avoid spending the time. You talk about time management, but you don't have a way to get past it. So let's go on to the question then, what is it that you're calling sermon block, and what causes somebody to have sermon block?
Well, most of us know that writing block usually refers to some writer sitting before a piece of paper or before the computer and simply can't put anything there. Nothing comes to his mind. And I think a similar thing can be true with sermon block. A preacher, if you're not in a congregation that uses the lectionary, then you've got to decide, okay, what is going to be my theme? What will be my scripture text? And some preachers have a huge, difficult time doing that. I know in my early years in ministry, that was a real struggle for me, trying to determine what I was going to preach each week and how I was going to do it. So you can have a sermon block simply there. You don't even know where to go. If you follow the lectionary, you can have at least 3 scriptures, and sometimes you can look at those scriptures and none of them leap at you, and you don't know where to go with them or what to do with them. You may read them and you're just blocked and don't know how to move. And I think the problem with that is so many preachers end up at the last minute trying to prepare a sermon. It's what we call Saturday night specials. All week that time has been consumed with pastoral ministry, all the other demands, administration, everything on them, and now they've got to throw together a sermon. And they literally can get blocked because they haven't done anything to get ready for it. To me, the answer is basically preacher has to do long-range sermon preparation. You need to think down the road what you're going to do. In churches where I didn't follow the lectionary all the time, I would do series of sermons. There are all kinds of series you can do. It's almost endless. The Lord's series on the Lord's Prayer, the Beatitudes, the disciples. On and on you can go. And series of sermons allow you to think ahead. What is going to be the scripture for that? What will be the theme? So you can acquire the necessary books. You can do the preparation for it and think ahead. And then you would block off, as we say, a certain amount of time every single day to focus on it. And then you're going to move forward. And now you may sit down and still have a little struggle in how to get started. But what I've learned to do is I force myself to get into it. And when I start on a scripture text, I don't go to the commentaries first. I just see, what does it say to me? What do I sense here as I try to understand it? And then I go to the commentaries, and then I make big notes. I still put mine on pieces of yellow paper, as I write down whatever comes to me. And then I try to see which way the focus is going to go as I pull them together. Now, in my early years, before I really got into long-range planning, what I discovered sometimes on Saturday night, I would have to end up staying up almost all night long to get that sermon ready, because I wasn't blocked, but I just had not given myself the proper time to get to it. And I made a vow to myself that I would never go into the pulpit unprepared. I would always go prepared. Now, sometimes I went rather weary, and tired. But I think sermon block happens to people primarily when they have not done preparation, when they've not done long-range studying, wide reading. I got to the point in my ministry, I didn't have time to preach everything I wanted to preach. I mean, that's the honest truth. I never had time to do it all because I read so widely. So many things were aired before me that I wanted to do that I think if you do that, you're not going to suffer from a sermon block because you're going to see so many things you want to preach about because it's really.
I wonder, Bill, and maybe others maybe would concur, that one of the causes of sermon block is a lack of confidence in yourself as a person who is able to deliver, to share, to proclaim, that you sit before the text, or I'm a lectionary preacher for the most part, you sit before the text and you don't feel confident to take that text to the people. And that might be, as you grow older and become more mature, you don't experience that, but maybe younger preachers find that is the case, that it's Craddock does talk about being without authority, but you can be lack too much authority and feel uncomfortable and lack the confidence to get up there and feel like you have something of value to say to the people in front of you.
If I understand your comment you're making, Bob, I think this doesn't mean the preacher's got to come across like you know everything and you have complete awareness of all things. Sometimes you may approach it by confessing your own inadequacy here as you're dealing with the passage. I mean, I preached a sermon on prayer one time, and I began it with, I don't understand people for whom praying is always easy. For me, it has always been difficult. It has been a struggle, and I go into that. And I think sometimes we can face a text and say, this text has been a real difficult one for me to get a handle on. I mean, I think honesty like that, it can be good. But you can say, as I have struggled with it, this is where I have come. You may find a little different perspective on it. You may help me as we try to wrestle with it as you bring the congregation into it. This is part of what Craddock talks about in inductive preaching. You don't have all the answers. You may be on a journey with your congregation seeking truth. I don't think the preacher should always come across pontificating. Sometimes you, like other members of the congregation, are searching for truth, searching for insights, and you can be confessional in that way, I think. I have.
I don't think that preachers need to be afraid of those times when we have sermon block, because those dry periods can be times when we find ourselves able to experience a certain renewal for the task. Just as the wilderness period in Scripture was a time for people to prepare for some new revelation, I think the same can be true for us preachers when we find ourselves in barren places. It may be an opportunity for us to refocus, particularly when we do consider this matter of competency and how we may not feel up to the task. Then we become more dependent on the Spirit to speak through us. And in my own preaching, that's when I've found that my preaching has been most vibrant and most vital.
I don't know who said it, but it was well said. We don't preach because the sermon is ready. We preach because it's Sunday. I echo Bob's concern, especially as I remember my first year in ministry. I'm an introvert, and public speaking is not something that comes natural or easily to me, and I had nightmares every Saturday night for nearly the first year. And the idea of, I know that the text was ready. I had a sermon prepared, but I wasn't prepared to offer myself, I guess, to expose myself. And developing that self-confidence in the pulpit, in public, is something that I imagine a lot of young pastors have to wrestle with.
Yeah, I think that's true for most of us when we began. I think it's a shame that every young pastor doesn't have some mentor that he or she can talk with, that will actually listen to or watch videotapes of your sermons and give you feedback and give you encouragement and guidance. It's a shame every young pastor doesn't work with an older minister for a while, say a year, in a congregation as an associate, so you can learn some things there. And there needs to be some way that we have mentors, people who will help guide us along the way and encourage us and show us, well, you might do this a little different, or maybe, you know, this could, but you're strong here. I think all of that could be very encouraging for us.
Yes. Excellent. Excellent point.
I remember, and Doug remembers this well, when we had the seminary students, and they would preach in class, and they were videotaped, and then they had their peers evaluating them. That was always the most traumatic time they ever experienced. But yet, if all of us could go through life having somebody critique us more often, other than just our spouse, we might be a whole lot better preachers. So that's the reason I would encourage us to try to have a mentoring program. And that can be one of the things I think the Academy of Parish Clergy can try to assist us in the colleague groups. Here, these particular groups can allow us to have dialogue with each other, and maybe we could share tapes or videotapes or something of our sermons, so people could see these and get feedback in those groups and have some dialogue there. We need some place to have dialogue. I never saw myself preach a sermon until I came to teach preaching at Southern Seminary, and I preached at a downtown church that videotaped its services, and I got a copy of that. Here, look, that's how old I was before I ever saw myself preaching. But today, young preachers can see themselves very young, you know, preaching. Most seminaries have this program that ministers go through today, which I think is very worthwhile.
Yeah, I want to cut in here for just a minute because we have an audience question. And first I want to underline what Bill said about the Academy of Parish Clergy, because I enjoyed in Wisconsin at the conference talking to a number of pastors, and many of them were talking about how important it was to have interaction with colleagues who could help you out with the various kinds of problems that you might have. But our audience question has to do with preparation, and the question is, how much of your sermon preparation and study time is spent in prayer?
Well, I mean, I think a minister needs to devote a good bit of time to personal devotion time. Every sermon, if it is not bathed in prayer, is going to really be lacking something. So I think we have to do that. We pray before we start on the search. We pray in the process that we're doing it. And I have found, even in my own devotional prayer life, sometimes your preaching themes come out of that. It's amazing. But no, I can't put a number on it. I would have difficulty saying if you're preparing, let's say, you're spending 20 hours in sermon preparation, and 5 of that ought to be in prayer. I mean, I think the whole thing should be bathed in prayer. You're asking for God's guidance in everything that you're doing. I mean, I find myself sometimes when I'm cutting the grass and I'm going through my sermon and thinking about it, it's amazing. Sometimes my best ideas come to me in those moments, not just when I'm in my study or working on it. And that also can be a time of prayer, especially my wife and I walk every morning, and that walking time can be a time of prayer and reflection as well. So I think prayer is very important, and that's part of the section in the book in which we talk about a minister's devotional life, because he needs to focus very much on that. Someone else may want to make a comment.
I have what I call mulling moments, and I found it's helped me in my other responsibilities always to be mindful of the upcoming sermon and to be making it a matter of constant prayer. The praying without ceasing mentality has really guided me in terms of preparing myself. And I find that the more time I mull over the material in a prayerful manner, the better the sermon turns out to be.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that's one reason a minister needs to start early in preparation for the sermon, so he can give himself some time to do that, mulling over it, praying over it, in a way, rather than just last-minute preparation, which we all know that's not the best kind.
Yeah, the text itself becomes part of that you're dealing with, or the topic if you're a topical preacher, but that from the very beginning of the week, it's just part of who you are in your conversation with God and with everybody else you're in conversation with. And you might be in the shower, which you find that inspiration at interesting times and places.
Well, and that's why we never know all things like that. Now, some ministers even sort of form a group in that church that they dialogue some with about the text, get input from the congregation, which is part of their sermon preparation. Honestly, have never done that beforehand, but I know some ministers that do it, and that may be very helpful. Some who do it say that is, but again, they pray over it and mull it together. But that again can be in the collegiate group where you can get together with your friends and do it in that way. I think for the ministers.
I'll say one other thing on the question of sermon block. I think the person who raises the question has offered a very insightful reminder of how connected the preacher's devotional life is with his or her preaching, and I would counsel all preachers that when you find yourself in one of those dry seasons, the first place to start to analyze yourself is your spirituality, and how much your spirituality is informing your preaching. It may be that you discover that this is the place where you need to begin to do the most urgent work.
Well, on a practical level, I like to use the Lectio Divina approach as part of my sermon preparation and praying the text and mulling it over. We've all talked about, but the Lectio Divina is a particular process, a particular approach to Scriptures. We've all talked about how we live the text in sermon prep, living the text of the Scriptures, living the text of the sermon as it develops, whether it's mowing the yard, walking with the wife, taking a shower. The preaching process kind of is the focal point and the energy point for all of us as pastors, I think.
Okay, well, if that's why don't we move to one of those, at least any group of pastors I've ever talked to, great controversial questions. Bill already brought up lectionary preaching versus series, and I know we get into then expository versus topical, and so on in preaching. If I could direct it, do you like the lectionary approach? And if you do the lectionary approach, how do you also avoid, or do you have an opportunity then to get into texts outside of the lectionary? And if you don't, how do you avoid getting into a rut where you preach, say, on your favorite topic over and over and over again?
Well, I think if a minister's following a lectionary, obviously you have various texts that you can select, and you can decide which one or several of those you want to focus on, and you have some guidance. But I have found that I can stay away from preaching in a particular rut when I do series. I never was in a congregation that followed the lectionary all the time. I would follow it some, but I like so much doing series and things like that. And I think when you plan ahead and read widely, you're not going to end up getting in little ruts and preaching on the same thing all the time. And I also found out that when you discover what are some of the real needs in your congregation, your preaching can respond to those needs. When I was pastor of one of my churches, one of the needs that we had in the congregation, there was so much grief because we had looked like one death after another. Sometimes there would be 3 funerals a week. And so I did a series called Facing Grief and Death, trying to help the congregation learn how to deal with that. And I mean, I think you can plan these things and think ahead on them. But it takes wide reading, takes wide preparation, and it takes involvement with the congregation. And I think no matter what kind of sermon we're preaching, whether it's expository, doctrinal, ethical, from a lectionary, we always need to take into consideration the human needs of the people. What are you trying to offer these people that can help this text live for them today? How can it make a difference in their lives? And is it not just something stuck back in the first century? How does it relate to them today? And so that's part of what every preacher's got to try to do, to me. Make the text live for the people to whom you're preaching today.
We did have an audience question that comes in on that same topic, which is asking, how do you keep it relevant, especially if, say, you're a lectionary preacher, and how do you keep the preaching relevant to the congregation if your topics are set essentially by the church year and by the lectionary readings?
Well, I think you can still do that, because every text in there, for the most part, is still going to have some relevance in some way for the people to whom you're talking today. You find out what is the intention of this text. Let's say it's David who is having, well, let's take it one of his worst cases, his adulterous affair. I mean, here you deal with the intent of the text, which is talking about that, and then you bring it into how we ought to live as moral, Christian people in our lives today. So whatever the lectionary text might be, you still seek to find what can be the intent of that text and how can it relate to our people today. And I think if the text doesn't have any meaning for us today, I really say, what's the point in reading it? What's the point in preaching it? Because it's not just to give them some information biblically, but it's to say, how does the text relate to my life today? How can Christ help me to live a different kind of life as I seek to follow the intention of what the Scriptures are teaching me today? That, to me, it's very important.
As a preacher, I follow the lectionary most of the time. I use that as the basic grounding of how I preach during the year. But and then generally sometime during the year I'll do a series, maybe more than that. But what Bill said is true. Is you sit with a text and you're asking the text, what is it saying in this time and place? Mm-hmm. And the text, I don't think I've ever found that I'm sitting with the text and not finding anything that it says. And if it doesn't, sometimes we have to argue with the text. Maybe we don't like what the text has to say, and we need to bring that out. But it's still, there is plenty. And then there are other lectionaries besides the RCL. There's a number of alternative fourth-year lectionaries, one of which I've done some work with. So you can have plenty of options, even in lectionaries, to go beyond the traditional 3-year cycle.
Right. Well, and if you find a text, especially if you get one of the Old Testament texts that's really weird, you can, part of what you're saying here, you can argue with that text and say that we don't respond exactly like that today. We don't stone, our people when they do certain things. This was relevant in that day and age, but we've gone beyond that in our understanding what Jesus is teaching us today. So, I think we have to remember we are New Testament people. As we read the Old Testament, we try to understand it in the light of the teachings of Jesus and not just get stuck back in the past and say, okay, well, it says that there, so there we are, Right. I would have real trouble with that.
There's a text coming up that I'm going to preach this summer. It's the story of Jacob going to Laban, and he worked 7 years to get a wife, and he thinks it's Rachel, and it ends up being Leah, and he has to. He says, to Laban, you tricked me, and Laban says, well, and this part we don't marry off the younger one to the older before the older one's married. And so when we think about, we have these conversations about what's biblical marriage. Well, Laban's saying, in our parts might be different than your parts, and this is the way we do it. So, it's a kind of an interesting text that seems very odd, but yet in terms of the conversations that we're having about marriage and our culture today, here's a perfect text. And you wouldn't go there, perhaps, but it's there.
Right. Well, and I think we have to be honest when we deal with texts like that. Say that we have changed in our thinking on some of these things. People in our society today may not have 7 wives. I mean, how many people, have 7 wives? So, I mean, we've moved in a different kind of direction with this. And let's talk about what Christian marriage is like today. But you can also deal with Jacob, who was the big trickster himself, gets tricked. I mean, there's a wonderful twist you can have on that one. So you play with it a little bit and talk about, well, how are we supposed to live? I mean, there are lots of things we can find in these texts.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things, Bill, you said earlier is that, whatever you're a lectionary preacher or a topical preacher, whatever the challenge is always there to help demonstrate the relevance of the Scripture to today. That's a challenge. It's always before the pastor, regardless of what format of preaching we do.
Yeah, I think that first you try to find out what is the text saying in its day. What is its meaning then? Then what is it saying to us today?
Yeah.
We have to find both. And then we try to follow the intention of the text, if we can, for our own day, if it's realistic in what we're trying to do.
I think that Doug has been trying to bring something in for the last couple of minutes.
Well, I was just going to say that every text has a point of contact, or should have a point of contact. If it doesn't, then we probably don't need to address it on that particular Sunday. And application is a part of a lot of preaching that I think is missing today. Many preachers do a good job of exposition. They give the background of the text. They do a wonderful work with interpretation. But I remember the very first book I ever read on preaching, H. Grady Davis's Design for Preaching. He talks about the so what. What difference does this make? And I think people today are yearning to hear the difference that a text can make in their everyday experience. And by the way, Overcoming Sermon Block does a great job of addressing application and how critical it is in the sermon.
I want to ask another question. Having 4 people with who are preachers and have really studied on this, a young pastor friend of mine told me that he did not seek to make the text relevant to the congregation, but rather to make the congregation relevant to the text. How would you respond to that line?
I think it's a both and. I don't think it's an either or. I think that's part of the work of the preacher is to bring both worlds together and to be true and to be fair to both worlds.
Yeah, I would underscore what Doug has just said. I mean, I think it's not an either or. You need to discover what the text is saying, but as Doug was saying here, if the congregation does not feel like it has any message for them, they're not going to listen to it. They don't care if it was good back there first century or if Paul said it or whoever said it, unless they can see that it's meaningful and will have an impact on their lives today. And one of the best ways you can help the congregation to grasp that is through some illustration, through some story, some word, metaphor, something that can connect with their lives, not just an argument. People remember stories like Jesus' parables better than anything else. And one of the saddest things is to hear a preacher never use any illustrations or stories. They need to spend a lifetime collecting them, reading everything in the world you can find to get those kinds of things, because that's what connects with the congregation. Most congregations will remember a story or an illustration from the sermon when they may not remember anything else that is there. And that story needs to be something that can connect with our lives with the text. And so I encourage preachers really to work hard at that. And I've spent endless hours always trying to find what I consider the appropriate kind of illustration or story to drive home the point in any sermon that I preach.
Well, maybe what the speaker was trying to point out is the timelessness of the text, and there's a challenge to raise our congregation up from the changeable situations, the minutiae of our daily lives, and help us see ourselves from the perspective of eternity and get a broader picture and see where we are in the endless line of splendor and the flow of God's grace working itself out in the world.
Well, that may be, may be true, David. But I mean, take for example, the text where Jesus says, "Be ye therefore perfect, as my Father in heaven is perfect." Yeah. I mean, that of course is something that's beyond all of us. How does that apply to us? Is that not the goal toward which a Christian reaches? That we cannot have we're seeking to have spiritual perfection, which we know we never truly achieve, but we follow the model of Jesus as we're trying to go after that. And I don't know, it's hard to say you're always just going to model it after the text. I think sometimes the text leaps out, and then we have to see how can we translate that text for today. Because if the preacher doesn't act responsibly in learning how to translate the biblical words so that it's meaningful for people today, and if it just stays back there in that ancient text, it's not going to change lives. It has to be put in modern language, because one of the criticisms of preaching and religion today is that we use these terms that people don't understand anymore. I think a lot of people today, you talk about sin, you've got to think a long time. Some people don't think much about sin anymore. They don't think anything much of sin anymore, or even faith, or salvation, atonement, on and on. As we get into these theological words, they've got to be translated.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. Grasp them in meaningful ways today.
Now, those words don't even have this. They don't have the same meaning today they did 30 years ago, and culture has changed so much. You constantly retranslate. I have maybe an analogy from sailing. I like to sail, and as a sailor, I have to watch the line and the tackle and the sail, and the practical up close stuff. But I also need to keep an eye on the goal. Check my course to make sure that I'm going to eventually get to the harbor toward which I'm heading. And in preparing the sermon, we need to do both of those. There's got to be a practical application that people can take from the sermon, how this affects their life, in this day and this time. And sometimes there's got to be a view of that eternity. This is the end product. This is the goal, the quest towards which we're headed.
Well, I think most people come on Sunday mornings hungry for some word that's going to help them in their lives. And I think they go away dissatisfied when the preacher just stays in the text, mm-hmm. and never brings it into life for them today. We've got to work hard at trying to let them see, what is it saying for me today?
Yeah.
Okay, I've got an additional question here off of Bob's list that I'd certainly like to hear some answers to. Talks about how does technology affect preaching this day. I was talking to somebody in the last couple of weeks who mentioned to me that a congregant had told him that they wanted to see him carry his Bible to church, and they were disappointed to see that he didn't. Well, the fact was that he was using it on his iPad, and and used that, as a matter of fact, in the pulpit. And of course, I think probably most of you have experienced having people in the congregation who are texting or putting comments on Twitter or Facebook right in the middle of the sermon. How does that and other technology impact the way you work as a preacher?
Well, I think in some ways technology is an advantage for ministers. I mean, obviously, as we mentioned a while ago, you can see yourself now preaching on videotapes. You can listen to yourself, all kinds of means, YouTube and whatever. Plus, you've got opportunities to use computers to go to almost any library you want to and get resources, from them. There are all kinds of technological advantages that they have. Now, one of the dangers is that preachers will go to some of these sermon sites and they will get the whole sermon right off of that, because they'll give you a complete sermon with illustrations and everything else. And preachers need to realize that a lot of other preachers read that stuff too. And I heard one person say one time they went and heard one preacher preach a sermon, and they went to another church and heard the same sermon there because they both got it off the internet and they both preached it. I mean, I think we have to be very careful about that. I personally have not found the sermon sources very helpful on the internet. Others may. I guess I like to do my own digging and commentaries and things more like that. But I do think technologically there are a lot of wonderful advantages. There's some wonderful lectionary sites that you can find there. Almost every denomination has got, some. Plus there's some major ones. So I think there are a lot of things that preachers can learn and do there. And what in the world would it be like today if we couldn't type our sermons and have our computers and so forth to put them on that and had to go back to the old typewriters and stuff? I have iPads, and you've got your phones you can take almost any place and be in contact almost instantly with people. So there are wonderful advantages. Of course, none of us like to see some kids texting in church. I don't know how you'll ever overcome that unless the sermon is so exciting, you've got to listen to it. So I think that's part of what we have to work at to make them want to listen. Again,
I did a series once, Bill, where I invited people to text questions, and I responded to several of those questions after the sermon, and that was in the early stages of texting. It had just become a widespread phenomenon, and people were showing up in church, in worship, with their smartphones, and I worked with my staff to talk about how we might be able to take advantage of this technology, and that was one of the suggestions that one of my younger staff made, and we tried it, and it was quite successful.
Yeah.
Wouldn't do it every Sunday. It keeps you on your toes because you have no idea what they're going to be asking.
I think, like you say, it can be exciting like that.
Mm-hmm.
To me, some of the most exciting things I always had in preaching was when I'd have some dialogue sessions afterwards. Sometimes you would have them on the same day you preached the sermon, or sometimes you'd have them on, like I did often, on Wednesday night. But here you had it immediate with the questions being texted to you. I think that could be exciting, but I'm not sure I'd want that every week.
And the other thing you have to be careful for, you need to double check your references in this day, because when you mention something and you cite a reference, you can be sure that somebody's going to check you out. They're going to go behind you. They're going to Google it. And if for some reason you weren't correct in your statement, they'll let you know about that pretty quickly.
Well, that's true. Now, I learned that when I was pastor at St. Matthew's Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky. We had a lot of seminary professors and seminary students, and I didn't dare say anything in my sermons I had not carefully researched and checked, because I knew that somebody was going to come in. And if I ever did misquote something, I heard pretty quickly.
I wonder, though, and one of the reasons why I asked the technology question is in terms of our culture. The reality is that preaching is a very oral medium, and our society's become very visual, and it's partly that short attention span, but it's a change. And we watch, the difference between listening to something on radio. My father grew up listening to The Shadow and different things, and Dragnet. And those were radio programs. Now we watch those on more and more advanced video. And so how do we speak to a community for whom the monologue, which is what a sermon is, whether it's 20 minutes or an hour, is a less dynamic medium? And I remember this was about a decade or so ago when David Letterman rather than Jon Stewart was at the top of the bill, or Colbert. But there were preachers, younger preachers that were doing top 10 lists as their sermon outline, trying to catch up. So how do we? My preaching and many of our preaching still has a core of the traditional oral feel to it, but do we keep on chasing the current format, or do we just do our thing.
Well, that's the reason I think, of course, you need to have variety in the kind of preaching you can do. And I think the more narrative you have in your preaching, the more people are going to listen to it, even today. Interesting thing is, we talk about how preaching has changed and people, don't want to hear it. But I do not know a single pastor search committee that preaching is still not their number one priority in what they want in a pastor.
No.
So, I mean, I know it's changed, but I think what people are tired of is bad preaching.
Mm-hmm.
And if you get somebody that's really a good, exciting preacher, people will listen. And I think a part of what needs to be in that is story, narrative, and not pontification. It may be sometimes an indication of your own weakness, and you're bringing them, making the congregation a part of your journey in that sermon as you are moving toward trying to find truth, rather than just always trying to give them the truth, helping them to discover it with you. That's part of what Craddock was talking about in inductive preaching. And the preacher's going to do this if he shows what we talk real feeling. If preachers do not put themselves into the sermons. See, I think a lot of preachers, as David was saying earlier, I think it was David or Bob, one of you, I forgot which one, who talks about they do a good job of research and analysis and interpretation, but then the application is not good, and because they're really not into the sermon. People wonder, is this sermon really believable? And if the preacher is coming across like he or she doesn't believe it, then most congregation is not going to get involved in it. So that involves what I call feeling. And I can remember hearing preachers and wondered, he just wasn't into that sermon today. Well, he or she may not be, but if you're not into it, you're not going to pull your congregation. So I think I wouldn't give up completely on the oral style, because a lot of what you find on television and some of these night shows, whatever, they spend a certain amount of time doing oral stories and conversations, and I think preaching's still going to be around a while.
One of the developments that I find encouraging, I did not know about until relatively recently, is the phenomenon of TED Talks. Y'all may be familiar with those, but these are talks that are relatively brief, 15 to 18 minutes. They're offered extemporaneously. They're narrative-based. It's an acronym for technology, engineering, and design.
Yeah. There's TED Talks on the NPR station I listen to some, and there's another series, I think it's Moth
Story Hour.
Moth Story, that's the one, yeah. And both of them
what
are great.
I was taught to do 20 years ago.
Great stories. Great stories. All narrative.
Yeah. Well, that's important. I think if you're going to use narrative, though, it's got to have some purpose in it. You're not just telling a story that doesn't have any purpose. Because I've heard some preachers tell stories, and I couldn't figure out what is the purpose of that story. There ought to be some meaning in it. Or else the people, like some of the parables of Jesus, you're trying to discover what is he saying. And if that's a part of it, that's great. You don't have to tell people what you're saying all the time, but grip them with it so they'll want to listen, or maybe come up with an interpretation.
That's the challenge of inductive preaching. Craddock does it great. Brett Younger does it great. Mike Graves does it great. I've heard a whole lot of really bad inductive preaching.
Yeah.
Of a bunch of stories that go nowhere, and they think they've done a great job because they've told 15 stories, but you sit down, you haven't a clue what it is what they were doing that day. So
yeah, I recall going to a preaching conference one time, and a ministerial student walked right onto the platform, sat down, and he spent 15 minutes telling a story. And after he finished, he walked away. And another minister and I looked at each other and said, what was the point of that? I mean, see, there was no real meaning to it. We couldn't get into it. And just telling a story in and of itself may not be, sufficient. Story's got to be taking you someplace, or giving you some direction, or trying to help you in some way, not just talk.
Tell a story.
Yeah.
Craddock always knew he might not tell you everything along the way, but you know that he knows where he's going as he tells the story.
Well, all of us, I'm sure, have heard Fred Craddock. If you've heard Fred Craddock preach, you know you have to listen. And he's a person you can't ignore.
Right.
His preaching just pulls you into it and you listen to it.
Okay, well, we're coming up on 5 minutes until we're out of time. And I'm going to skip down. We probably already discussed what happens if on Sunday morning nothing is there. I think in Overcoming Sermon Block, Bill more or less said it's too late at that point.
Well, it could be, but I know one preacher that came on Sunday morning, and he stood before the congregation when it was time to preach and said, "The Lord has not given me a message today, so let's go home."
There we go.
I don't know how many preachers could survive very long doing that, but
you don't do that every Sunday.
I mean, I have a feeling that you ought, if you honestly do not have a sermon, and Sunday morning comes, you'd probably better to walk into the pulpit and tell your congregation, you know, I just did not have a sermon this morning, but I found one by Harry Emerson Fosdick or Fred Craddock that I thought was wonderful, and I'd like to share that one with you this morning. So, I mean, and just be honest and let people know what you're doing. They might appreciate that in some way. But I think most of the time, if you don't have a sermon, you ought to stay up in the night until you've got something to say, even if it may not be the best word you're ever going to say. Most congregations are not going to be very patient if you come too many Sundays and don't have anything to say.
Okay, well, I'd like to give everybody an opportunity to make a concluding remark. And why don't we start with Dave?
Oh.
And I'll move across my screen here, and so that each of you have a chance for just a minute or so.
Well, I don't be too hard on ourselves, and there's always next Sunday. I have preached sermons that I thought were incredible, and I remember the time walking home afterwards, and I asked my wife what she thought of that, and she said, well, it was better 3 months ago when you preached it. And there's been Sundays I've got in the pulpit with not a thing in my head to say, and I struggled through 15 minutes and gave up, and folks afterwards commented on how rich and powerful the message was to them. So the Spirit has a way of working on the congregations, sometimes even in spite of ourselves.
How about you, Doug?
God's word does not return to God null or void. That's the great promise that we're offered in Scripture. I'm excited about preaching. I've never been more excited about what I do at any point in my ministry. And I do want to commend Bill Tuck's book, both to new preachers who really do need some help getting started, but also to us preaching veterans who just need to be renewed in our preaching. I think he offers a wonderful nuts and bolts presentation. There are questions at the back of each chapter that help us to focus our attention on applying those points. And every preacher would be better served by giving serious attention to Bill's book.
Okay, and Bob is as the editor for the series. Go ahead.
Well, I want to commend Bill for writing the book and for helping us create a new series, because the series that the Academy of Parish Clergy and Energeon had developed was for a briefer book, and Bill's came in longer than our page or word number, and so working with that, we decided that there was need for shorter books and longer books, and so the Guides to Practical Ministry is a result of Bill's contribution, and it is a welcome book for preachers. And one of the things I think we can learn is that as all of us here tonight that have been talking, we've been doing this for a little while. I've probably been doing the shortest amount of time of the four of us, but with maturity, with time comes maturity, and we learn how to do this, and we learn what we need to do. And Bill is a good encourager and a good teacher, for that. And so on behalf of the Academy of Parish Clergy, I'm glad that Bill has made this contribution, and David's book, Ken Ira Groff's book, to the other series. There's really a nice a group of books that so far we've been able to put together, and more will come. And so appreciate the good work that that our authors have done.
Thank you, Bill.
Hey. And now, Bill, go ahead.
Well, it was my joy to write this book. I've taught preaching and been doing it for years, and it gave me an opportunity to pull together my thoughts. And I hope if younger preachers and other ministers can find help in the book, I will be very happy for that. And so I hope people will read it, because the primary purpose is to encourage preachers and to help them be better at the task, because I'm like Doug, I'm still excited about preaching, and I preach every opportunity I get, and always will until I'm gone.
Well, and I'm thankful to all of you and to the Academy of Parish Clergy for preparing this series. It's one of the great pleasures I have with the publishing company, is being able to work with a group that is doing such good work, and the material that you gentlemen and ladies provide. And so we're very thankful for that. That'll conclude our Hangout on Air for tonight. For anybody who's looking for it, Google processes it, and it usually takes about 45 minutes to an hour for people to be able to see it after the fact. So again, thanks to everyone, and I'm going to close this down.